Hi, I'm Gary, and this is EV Musings, a podcast about renewables, electric vehicles, and things that are interesting to electric vehicle owners. On the show today, we'll be looking at how EVs are promoted and sold. This season of the podcast is sponsored by ZapMap, the go-to app for EV drivers, helping you find and pay for public charging with confidence. Our main topic of discussion today is EV promotion. Now, long-time listeners of the podcast will know that I'm a big fan of the old PSA, public service announcement. Back in the day, we had the Green Cross Code man, Charlie Says, Clunk Click Every Trip, although the least said about the face of that campaign, the better. Tell Sid, etc. All of those kind of public service announcements. Now, all of these had two things in common. They were funded and created by the government, and they were designed to educate the public. Now, there's very few of these around nowadays, and I think that's a shame. Which is why I was really interested when I came across an article entitled "The EV Ad No One Is Making, But Someone Really Should," from former guest of the show, James McKemey. In it, he was basically advocating the fact that TV commercials for electric vehicles should focus less on the cool and groovy features of each car and more on the lifestyle improvements you can get from going electric. So let's speak to James about this. Can I ask you to start by introducing yourself and let the listeners know where you work and what you do, please?
Thank you very much, Gary. My name's James McKemey. I founded a company called Rapid Charge Paradox Limited. It's a consultancy in the EV and EV charging space. People may know me previously from several roles at PodPoint, where I served over 14 years, or the company formerly known as PodPoint, now known as Pod.
Now, my overarching thesis in this episode is that there isn't enough general education about electric vehicles and the EV lifestyle or benefits. Now, at the moment, the onus is on individuals to learn about the ecosystem and on OEMs to educate about the cars. But if you look at any electric car advert from pretty much any OEM, you'll see a lot of commonalities. You'll see beauty shots of the cars travelling down remarkably empty streets. You'll see some buzzword about electrified futures. You'll see promotion of a phenomenal range of up to 350 miles. You'll see the small print indicating that it's WLTP and not real life. You might get a shot of someone plugging the car in at home. And the issue with this is that it's crap, basically. It tells the prospective customer absolutely nothing about living with an electric vehicle. Now, taken literally, someone would expect the car to be able to do 350 miles with ease and just be refilled by plugging into a standard small charging socket. It says nothing about different ranges that you might get. It says nothing about what to do if you don't have home charging. It says nothing about using public chargers. It has zero education for an end user. Now, you're here today because you and I have something specific in common when it comes to electric vehicles, and we both think that they're not being well promoted as a concept. Not from the point of view of the OEM selling one of its vehicles into the market, but from the point of view of selling the bigger EV experience to the end users. So just as an opening gesture, talk to me a little bit about your thinking behind that, please.
Thanks very much, Gary. And I completely agree with you. And you may see on my LinkedIn page on my website, I wrote a blog about a concept for an advert, which really would, in my view, kind of highlight the reality for most people living with an electric car. But I think you mentioned the people who are potentially selling this are often OEMs. If we look at the stakeholders in this environment who have potential budget to spend on advertising campaigns, etc., I mean, OEMs are probably front and center. And I think they have some challenges in this space. The first is that they need to market their product. So if we're talking about the experience of living with an EV, that is not unique to their product. So they need to move quite quickly to the features which are. So if you just gave us a good overview of a typical kind of advert for an EV, and that often is about the design. So a lot of the advert will be based around the aesthetics of the vehicle and things like that, which we're very used to from all kinds of car advertising, right? But the challenge is it's leaving a void. If you don't understand what it is to drive an EV, this leaves you in that period of kind of uncertainty of, well, I see that you make this EV. I don't really know what that means to me. I know what my petrol or diesel car and living with that is like. So I've not been particularly well informed. That's such a critical element of the real benefits of living with an EV. Gary, you mentioned the challenges for those who can't have a home charger, and those are real. And I've operated an EV for a long time without having a home charger and charged pretty much exclusively on the public network. So I understand that way of life. But I think where we are in terms of the uptake process at the moment, in terms of the adoption curve, I don't think we're making the most yet of those who can charge their car at home. And I don't think we're even selling that properly. But I agree with you that someone needs to, because I think that critical piece of education is lacking. And if it's coming from anywhere, it's coming from our peers. It's coming from seeing the Joneses suddenly got an EV down the road, and it doesn't look anything like what I'm hearing in all these negative chats. That just seems really easy. And that at the moment is probably the most powerful message that's out there, peer pressure, effectively, or this observing it amongst our peers. But it's a frustration of mine, certainly, about the way the discourse across the industry. Someone needs to really sell the reality of living with an EV.
It's very similar with solar panels. If one person in a block gets solar panels, then you'll find that a number of others do as well. But I think the key difference is, from a solar panel point of view, you put them in, you work with them for a couple of days, you see how they work. It's black or white. They either work or they don't. Whereas if you look at electric vehicle, you can get an electric vehicle, somebody can get one delivered on the back of a low loader with a guy who's never driven an electric vehicle. He'll hand the keys over, he'll go, well, there you go, mate, disappear. There's no education. There's no understanding of how to leverage the best parts of the electric vehicle. And I'm assuming we're going to come on and talk about things like, preconditioning and being able to sit at home and defrost your car while you're having your coffee, that sort of stuff. That never happens. And therefore, the Joneses who've got their electric vehicle are undereducated. And then when you go over and go, well, how are you doing with that car? And they go, well, it's all right, but, I'm not sure about this, and I'm charging in public and it's costing me a fortune and all that sort of stuff. So I think the kind of thing that we're talking about is we've got to get that base level of education. Now, I've done 260 plus episodes of a podcast trying to get that level of education, and I've had a level of success. Is it enough? No. Could there be more? Yes. And one of the things that I've advocated for a long time is do you remember the old Charlie Says, the public service announcements, or the Green Cross Code, or Clunk Click Every Trip, or, that sort of thing. There has to be something that is funded. Now, we'll talk about the funding in a second, but there has to be something that's funded to the point where it appears on all the television channels. It appears on all the social media channels. You'll get the 30-second version. You'll get the 15-second version. You might get the 1-minute version. And it's constantly there in people's faces. Now, you alluded to that earlier on because, I've read the script that you put together for the advert that you wanted to do at PodPoint, or Pod as it is now. Fantastic. And it's pretty much aligned with the kind of thing that I was thinking about putting together. But how are we going to get something like that funded? Because it's not cheap.
That's a great question. I think you alluded to a couple of bits about practical education there, which I know I've seen in the real world. I mean, a classic one is knowing where the DC pins are on your socket. So I had two experiences, and this is some time ago. It's when the first Peugeot, the E206, whatever the little guy is. I was charging next to someone who was using basically 11 kilowatt AC outlet on a rapid charger. And I said, why don't you use the CCS? And she said, oh, no, I didn't get that on the car. It's not on the car. And I said, I don't want to be that guy, but I think I probably should be that guy. I said, no, it is. And I said, just show you. So you pull that out. She said, oh, my goodness, that's going to save me loads of time. And I thought that's really weird that you weren't even told that at the point you bought the car. It seems confusing, which is great. But I guess coming back to the point of emphasizing the convenience of home charging, the next person I saw actually had a pod point, and I was walking, this was in COVID times, we walked around the local village and saw this really very pretty installation on this sort of timber clad garage outhouse building they put it on. And I went to ask if we could use it for marketing, because we'd actually seen this one came through on the installer's photo. Said, oh, this looks awesome. And they were happy to do that. But I noticed I had this Peugeot, and I said, just while I'm here, just like a few days ago, I ran into this lady, and she was charging. She wasn't aware of how to rapid charge it. Are you aware of how to rapid charge your car? So same process. And no, she wasn't. She didn't know. And so I pulled the thing out. But instead of having the reaction the other lady had, which was, oh, goodness, thank you. Why didn't they tell me that before? She looked at me with derision and said, why would I care? What's the point? That's got over 200 miles in it every morning. When am I ever going to use that? And the answer is for her, she won't. She absolutely won't. now I'm not an advocate of doing away with DC charging or removing the DC charging sockets. Clearly, they have massive value. But I thought, in terms of a mindset, someone who's got their EV, they're used to using it, they drive it every day and they love it, don't even need that. What are you on about? I just thought was really illustrative of how powerful just having a home charger is. Now, let's go back to your question of how you fund it. That's a really, really tricky question. And in my piece, I get into some of the challenges. Is an OEM going to step up and try and own this space? Not only have they got a short window in which to try and get over the benefits and features of their own vehicle, not the general experience of driving an EV, a lot of the OEMs who have the funds to pursue advertising in this space have one foot in the EV camp and one foot in the cash cow of the internal combustion or hybrid vehicle going. And that means if you really got across how awesome it is to not visit petrol stations, that might undermine your what is still probably your most reliable kind of revenue and margin product. So it may not be the OEMs at this stage, particularly the non sort of EV specific ones. And Tesla are interesting challenge here because they don't advertise, right? So that's a bit of a challenge from that side. So you were talking about a kind of a public interest campaign. And that comes back to, is that publicly funded? Is this taxpayer funded? And we've seen efforts here before. Gary, you and I have been in this industry long enough to remember Go Ultra Low. So that was a campaign which was part funded by, I think, SMMT members, vehicle manufacturers, OEMs, and sort of match funded, I think, by the government. It was useful to some extent, but it's not what you're describing. It's not sort of mass media campaign getting these messages over. And I guess we are in a time of extremely constrained public spending, really, really tough kind of fiscal position for the government.
I've done a little bit of thought about this, probably not as much as you, but I always cast my mind back to, it doesn't seem that much now, but when Apple first started advertising the iPhone, they would put together and fund a campaign and, whizzy high production values and that. And then at the end of it, you'd have the Apple logo, and then you would have the Vodafone logo, or you would have the EE logo, or you'd have the 3 logo. So from my point of view, that's a kind of a model that we should be looking at. There should be one central organization, and it doesn't have to be the government, but it could be. And they can get funding in from numerous different organizations, Charge UK, for example, some of the OEMs themselves, the AA, everybody who's got an interest in making sure that this works, they could all put an amount of funding in to create a pot. The central organization, whoever it is, could then produce that. And then what comes out of it could be sent back to the individual funders with their own branding on it to use as they wish. Now, yes, the OEMs may not want to do that for exactly the reason that you mentioned before. They're kind of cannibalizing their fossil fuel sales, and that's fair enough. But I could imagine someone like Charge UK putting that out, giving that out, GridServe being able to put something on that, Pod being able to use that, Osprey Charger being able to use that. I see that, there's value in there. The AA being able to use that. There's any number of organizations that have the potential to benefit from a model like that. What do you think?
I think that's a really interesting idea, and I wouldn't say I've done any more thinking than you, Gary. That sounds like you're quite advanced in your thinking on this. So it's easy to be sort of cynical about OEMs being, one foot in the EV camp, one foot in the hybrid and ICE camp. But that's the reality. I mean, I'm a bit more sympathetic to them. They have to make their business work. They have to make this transition work. And in my experience, they are keen to get this information over. It's just, are they keen to throw everything at it? That's the challenge. So you do see there's quite a lot of appetite within those organizations to educate drivers, to bring them on board, etc. So that's a positive. Charge UK, I'm sure, would be, or their members would be interested in that concept. Again, I think you're thinking of a central concept of this advert, which is trying to sell the concept of living with an EV to different drivers and sell the benefits, etc. And then at the end, you tack on different logos. I think that's a really interesting idea. Of course, you could do product placement throughout it. The challenge with product placement is obviously you might lessen the enthusiasm of some of the other potential if they see their competitors kit appear in the advert and not their own. But I think that's definitely a really interesting idea. And I have to say, as Apple adverts stay in my mind, getting on for 20 years old now, the old iPod adverts, etc. And then as we moved to iPhone, that was a very, very powerful campaign. So yeah, I mean, I'd be very interested in the pursuit of that. I guess looking around the industry, I mean, a body like Dan Caesar's EV UK might be quite well placed to look at that with a real sort of broad consumer angle, looking at EV as a whole. That I don't want to suggest this is something they must immediately do, but that would be one body that is well placed to potentially take that on. And yeah, I think that's a really interesting concept. Yeah.
Now, the other thing that you brought up there, and I've discussed this on the podcast before, primarily with Kate Tyrrell, which is, do OEMs really want to sell electric vehicles? And here's the experience that I gave. I was at an event that had test drives with numerous OEMs there, and I got into a BMW i something or other, to my detriment. I can't remember exactly what it was, with a young lady from the dealership in the seat next to me. And normally, if you're doing a test drive, you start to ask about the car and that. But me being me, I wanted to ask about the dealership and how they're selling electric vehicles. So the first question I asked is, so what vehicle do you drive? So bearing in mind, this is a woman promoting electric vehicles. She drives a diesel BMW 3 Series. I said, okay, fair enough. How many of your dealers drive electric? And she said, 2. I said, out of how many? She said, 10. I said, okay, given that there is a mandate to sell a minimum percentage of electric vehicles this year, and remind me what it is, 28% this year, is it? Something like that?
Yeah, obviously it comes out a bit lower with the flexibilities, but I think that's right, yeah.
So 1 in 4, give or take. Do you not think that as a dealership, there should be more people who actively live with electric vehicles on a day-to-day basis? And she kind of went, yeah, you're probably right. But the irony is, I did 2 other test drives that day, and I asked the same question. None of them drove electric vehicles. None of the people in the test drives with me drove electric vehicles. They had a different understanding of how many people within their organization drove electric vehicles, but none of them did it themselves. Now, I can forgive one of them because it was a Porsche Taycan Porsche Macan I was driving in. So, maybe they don't like to give those out to the dealers. But given that Porsche are part of a bigger chain of companies which have their own electric vehicle offerings, he didn't even drive one of those. To me, it would be great to get the OEMs involved in something like this. But I would have to think, would they seize on that as, right, we could throw some money at this and solve the problem and not have to worry about our dealerships? Or would they look at that and go, well, they're selling. Okay, we made our quota last year. We'll probably make it this year. Why do we need to throw more money at it? What are your thoughts on that?
The other thing with the dealership model, of course, is EVs actually represent a real challenge to their business model. So typically the vehicles are sold on relatively slim margins and the servicing is sold on very, very generous margins. And the beauty, as it were, of that model for an internal combustion car is it's absolutely packed with bits that wear out. So kind of by definition, everything on it is wearing out and needs replacing, and they can make a load of money on it. And by moving to EV, you kind of get rid of all those.
Yeah. Yeah.
Your clutch isn't going to cause you any trouble. The exhaust isn't a problem. I've never seen an EV blow a head gasket. So a lot of those challenges or opportunities go away, and therefore my enthusiasm as a car dealer to promote EV may be even more limited than that of the overall OEM. So that might be a challenge on that side of it. But I think you're right. It's another example of a slightly lukewarm. Yeah, we want to be doing well in EV, not least because we kind of have to because of the ZEV mandate and the potential for getting fines, whatever it might be, or really buying the credits at whatever value they are. And it would be good to see that we have a future as an OEM to continue to make our cars, be it in electric form, and people will like them. Those are good things. But our model today, it's very difficult, I think, to take a long-term view when you're a member of staff looking to hit your targets for that month, that quarter, that year. And I think we see that right the way through. I mean, we started with a conversation on how much they're willing to spend on really promoting how great EVs are. Well, I don't really want to undermine the sale of petrol cars by really pointing out that going to a petrol station is an absolutely hideous experience, of vast cost, etc. So I think we see again and again, it's not that your conventional OEMs are anti-EV or that they don't want to win this space. They do, but they aren't 100% in. And I just think that shows up in all different areas, not least your test drive experience.
Now, there are two aspects to the education part of this. We've already talked about one, which is educating the individual who's never been in an electric vehicle to understand the benefits of owning one, driving one. And you've talked about, never having to go to a petrol station again, etc. But the other aspect of this that we haven't touched on, but which is equally as important, is combating and countering the misinformation. So, for example, I would love to have just a 10 or 15-second advert somewhere where you got two people on their phones and one of them goes, "You drive one of those electric cars, don't you?" "Yeah." "So does the battery run out the same as it does on the iPhone? And you need a new one after 3 years?" And they kind of go, "Well, no, actually it doesn't, because it's not an iPhone and it's got a lot of complex tech underneath it that helps manage it, and it will probably last for longer than the car that it's sat in." What other things would you like to see specifically or generally that we push out in terms of combating misinformation, as well as the bigger topic of living in the EV sphere?
It's really tricky, isn't it? There are actors who clearly are motivated to put negative information out. You call it misinformation, whatever you want. There are two problems at play. One is that EVs have become politicized to an extent as part of kind of the net zero agenda, and becoming political football is not great fun, having seen that happen to us. And I really don't think it should be. I don't think you should be able to tell anyone's political opinions from the fact they drive an EV. And for all his sins, I think Elon has probably shown that. But there are some outlets that go beyond that, right? And we could name them. There are some newspapers that go beyond that. I mean, the thing I'd like to see is what the editorial discussion is. I remember there was a point where, EVs are the only growth sector in the automotive world, right? Everything else is in decline. And there was one month where they went pretty well, all to do with sort of both show up, I think, when you get really good months and quieter months, whatever. But there was a good month, and everyone was like, "Oh, look, EVs have jumped by whatever it was." And one of these newspapers, I won't name them, I'll be diplomatic, put out a headline: "EV sales decline X%. And what they'd done is they'd looked at private registrations, which are very small. So retail sales, sorry, not private registrations, retail sales, which remain a small proportion. And this is because of how brilliant the low BIC rate opportunity is. That is where most private buyers are getting their car. These aren't company cars. I mean, technically they are, but they are being bought by individuals who have access to really affordable, beautiful, very expensive cars. And that's really good. So the retail market isn't as big because it's being satisfied elsewhere. And that fluctuates, right? It's at a low level and it fluctuates. And in this month, it had gone down by a proportion. And they'd taken from that and said, "Oh, yeah, EV sales are falling." You're like, but no, EV sales leapt this month. I just how have you even worked that out? So someone clearly has said, find something in the data to make this look bad, because you wouldn't naturally do that. But part of me also thinks that I think it's a folly to get caught up on that. We all know, because we occasionally engage online, people who have decided that being anti-EV is a very good substitute for a personality. And this is sort of essentially has become their raison d'etre. And there is no point in trying to win that argument because it's irrelevant. You're not going to convince them. How do you win the argument? You ignore them and you go to the people who just want to drive a car that's decent, right? That fulfills their needs. And if you get to a point of critical mass, Luddite is kind of irrelevant, right? Well, everyone's just gone EV because it makes sense. I think Norway's a good extreme example here, right? We like to look at Norwegians, I guess, as benevolent and very sort of justice orientated and worthy. And I don't think they are at all, right? I just think they're people like everyone else. But because of their unique situation, they cook the books with their very high levels of tax and give EVs price parity straight away. So they've been running for over a decade with at least price parity, actually probably better on EV now. And they've achieved, 90% uptake, whatever it might be. That wasn't the result of some massive consumer campaign. That's because it just made sense, right? It was, oh, well, that's cheaper to do. And you got to a point of critical mass where the EV was no longer weird, and everyone knew people who drew, not just one person, they knew several people driving them. And to me, that's the thing that probably combats the misinformation. It's hopeless to keep telling people, oh, your car catches fire all the time, when 80% of your car park is full of these things. And everyone's like, Dave, you've got to let it go, pal. Like, what are you on about? The world's moved on. So part of me likes to think the organic market pressure and dynamics will put this right. That doesn't mean to say that there isn't value in someone tackling the reality and selling the real upside of living with an EV to some extent, because we can get that process to move quicker. The industry talks a lot about the early majority, and that's the real challenge we're at the moment. It was going through these 20% plus of uptake. There's a slight chasm to getting into early majority and then late majority, and then it flipped and it's gone and we all look like Norway. And I think there is still space for some campaigns, techniques, ways of informing people that would help get us there. And there's no doubt that the collective negativity that is being very deliberately put out there by some people is not helping with that.
I want to talk a little bit about the advert that you were proposing for Pod and the detail behind that. But before we do that, just looping back on the conversation about the misinformation from some of the newspapers. I don't know whether you saw it, but you mentioned him already. Dan Caesar from Electric Vehicles UK posted a graphic from an article where somebody's actually gone and done an analysis of all the motoring articles, I believe, across Mail, Telegraph, Times, Express, FT, Guardian, Sun, Mirror, and The Independent. Guess which of those had the most positive or mostly positive articles about electric vehicles?
Yeah, which are those? So, I mean, you'd not naturally think that sort of left-wing papers would be more inclined to disruptive environmental technologies, and therefore you expect to see that. So I would expect car reviews to be relatively similar across all of them, because that's kind of the nature of it. But then you'd see opinion pieces would slant negative in some of those, shall we say, centre-right publications. That would be my assumption, but I have a feeling, Gary, you're going to surprise me.
Well, I've got to say I was surprised. I'm not sure whether I should have been or not. In terms of totally positive, obviously The Guardian has more totally positive. As a percentage of all articles, The Guardian has mostly positive ones than anyone else. But in terms of positive and mostly positive, it's the Mirror. And I don't know why, but that surprised me. I would have expected, maybe a couple, but they're generally, as a rule, across all of the articles they've done where they mention electric vehicles, they've been mostly positive or positive overall, which, surprising. What do you think?
They are a left-wing publication, so maybe that fits with that kind of bias to some extent, pro-intervention and environmentalism. So that kind of makes sense. But then a tabloid, you might think not so much. So yeah, I mean, it's
ironically they're not that far behind, or they're not that far ahead of the Sun, which also has quite a lot of positive or mostly positive articles. So again, tell me nowadays, is the Sun mostly right wing or is it mostly left wing? It tends to swap.
Mostly right, I would think.
Yeah. Okay, that's good.
So yeah, but that would be another pleasant surprise. But I've certainly seen some quite clickbait anti-EV stuff in the Sun for sure. But equally, they review cars. There are some fundamentals about EVs that you can't really get away from. They're unbelievably brilliant in terms of performance. There's only a limit to how much you can sort of not mention that. I drove this, it was quiet, it was unbelievably quick, it was absolutely awesome. I mean, I didn't like it for a reason. Once you actually look at the cars of the product, it's quite hard to get away from it, other than just apply pure nostalgia. I like the sound of V8s. Yeah, I get that. I'm old too. But it's pure nostalgia, right? There isn't anything inherently good about that. It's just like, it reminds me of what I thought was good when I grew up. But yeah, no, it's certainly interesting.
So talk to me about the advert that you were proposing at Pod that contrasted ICE with electric vehicles. So what was that doing? What sort of things were you focusing on?
It's absolutely trying to own the experience of driving an EV. And as I say, I don't think anyone does that at the moment. OEMs want to own their car. No one is out there trying to own the experience of driving an EV. And I'm talking about mass market. So allow me to make generalizations here. I know it's very difficult to operate an EV if you have no home charging, you have no work charging, and there's limited public network around you. I appreciate that. There are edge cases where it is very difficult to drive an EV. But my favorite stat in all this stuff came out, I think, about 2018, 2019. So it's getting old, but I think it's probably still about true, which is 72% of drivers have access to off-street parking at home. It's in a PwC report called Powering Ahead, I think. And of course, it's drivers who drive cars, not households. So households works out about kind of 60-40 and split, but actually car drivers are slightly biased towards houses or living arrangements where they have off-street or parking of some description, and which would make sense if you think about it. So 72%, we're pushing 3/4 of drivers in the UK have access to off-street parking at home, and therefore have the potential to get some kind of home charger in. So let's talk mass market. Mass market has a home charger. Now let's focus in what the reality of using those things is. So this is not your middle-aged men on a YouTube channel who are going to go, I'm going from John O'Groats to Land's End again, because that's what I do every day. And I have to drive this enormous distance, and it's so key. If you can't do this, you can't live on. We all know that the average mileage per day is somewhere in the region of between 20 and 22, depending on which you look at it, miles, right? That's not very far. And if your EV did 25 miles, you would be disappointed with that. We really expect 10x that now, don't we? We expect to see 250 real world miles. So someone doing typical mileage in a typical EV, what does that look like? And what do we do on most days? We go to work. We go take kids to school. Kids go to school, we go to work, we do our shopping, we come home. That is the reality of how people operate their cars. So it was framing it in that environment. Right, how does that day start? It's a rush to get to work, to get to school, all those sorts of things. How does an EV help? Gary, you talked about that thing that I think is probably the most visceral first thing about the ownership of an EV, which is like, well, I don't have to use the scraper again. So yeah, the cars I start, it won't be by the time I go walk to it, right? And that's just kind of amazing. So let's highlight that. So we get up, we're rushing. We go to the car. One of the cars is defrosted. The other one have to run the engine, and we're scraping, and it's making us late and all that sort of stuff. The idea of the advert is a split screen. So as we go into the two experience of living with a nice car and living with an EV, they're side by side. So we're often running much happier in the EV. It was much quicker to get going, all those sorts of things. We're now a little bit late. You have a slightly stressed journey to school and work and all those sorts of things, whereas the EV one is much more serene. That then goes into your day, and you do your montage, whatever the kids are doing during the day, and they can be the same. So you merge into one. And then we come back to the end of the day. And my one on that is the idea that the mum is going to pick the kids up from school and then collect the husband from the station after she finishes her own work. So I'm sure there's lots of assumptions there which are questionable, but I think it's quite a realistic scenario. And the idea is we split again, and the warning light comes on in the petrol car. We're low on petrol, and it comes on in the EV. We're low on charge. So then I was like, oh no. In the petrol car, she has to go and detour via a petrol station on the way to get to the station. The mum's like, all right, better plug that in when I get home. She goes straight to pick the husband up after the kids get into the car, picks up that husband from the station, go home. The petrol car has to go to the petrol station. And this is a little bit mean, because I've got a 2-year-old daughter. So the world of mums and cars and parenting is very big in my world at the moment. And universally, mums hate petrol stations, to the point where often they won't even do it. They'll just say, no, you're going, but you do that later. You put petrol in the car for me, I'm not going. Because the point is, if you've got young kids, do you get them out of the car, which is a real faff, right? Getting them in and out of the car is a real faff. You then get them into the shop. Now you've got to mad mark them while they walk around the shop and pick things up and break things and all that kind of stuff. Or do you leave them in the car? And you're now a bad mum, right? I've got a Model 3 at the moment. If I leave my kid in the car and walk away from it, it beeps at me. I call it snitch mode. It does this really high-pitched sort of scream. You get a child detected in your vehicle. Like, I know, right? It wasn't very long. Anyway, so between the two, it's not great. Either of those is not a good option. And if you get your kids out of a car or a petrol station, it is just the bleakest environment. It feels so dangerous. You get a kid out that wanders. There's a throughput of cars the whole time. It's a hideous. Everything about this is absolutely wretched. Anyway, that delays them. They go to the station, pick up dad, who's now cold and bored and grumpy. They get home. Oh, of course, you see how much it costs to fuel as well. So that's a key thing. The first lot are already home. They're home, they're inside, they're looking at the app, seeing how much that this has cost, is like basically negligible. Oh, they forgot to plug in. Other lot come home, they're grumpy, they get in. The last part of the video is it cuts back to the kid runs outside, plugs the car in, runs back inside and shuts the door. Because your kid can do it. You wouldn't let your kid spray pressurized explosive about the place, would you? But plug an EV in. Yeah, plug an EV in. Yeah, great. The kid can do that as well. So basically, it's just to really highlight all the realities of that in the most mundane day. That is what you're selling. That is 90+% of your life with a car. That is what you really, really do. You do not drive from John O'Groats to Land's End. That is just, no one is doing that. So everyone is doing that scenario. And it's just to bring home that. Now, the bit that I a little bit have moral qualms about is if I'm a mum, now I'm thinking, if I have a petrol car, I'm really letting my family down. That's really terrible. I really should. Why am I taking my kids to a petrol station? This is absolutely awful. Well, wouldn't it be great if it just charged at home? It would be cheaper as well. I mean, this is something I should really do. And the mental load on mums to get everything right in their life is already vastly too high, and I'd be adding to it. But it wouldn't reduce its efficacy as an advert, because actually, from a family point of view, EVs are ludicrously better. In every way, you don't have the fumes, you don't have all those sorts of things, but also it's just, you now take ownership of the vast majority of putting energy back into it at your home, right? And I've not seen anyone come close to making that case, and that is the reality for the vast majority of usage. So I would love to see someone make that.
I think that's an excellent advert. I love the script when I read it. And I have one it's kind of similar, but
Well, I'm looking forward to this, Gary.
theme is more on, because the other thing that people, that I get pushed back a lot, especially around where I live, where they all like their diesel Range Rovers and things like that, is,
You live near Farnborough.
Well,
they like their Gulf Streams at Farnborough, Gary.
Well, there is that. There is definitely that, yeah. But there is the narrative, which is, well, I go down to the south of France every year in my car, and it's a nice diesel, and I can go all the way down there without refueling, and you can't do that with an electric vehicle, can you? And yes, absolutely right. You cannot get from where I am down to the south of France in an electric vehicle without recharging, unless you're Kevin Booker and drive at 20 miles an hour. But that's a different thing. But, in my mind, the advert is, you've got the guy in his diesel Range Rover and he sets off, and in the background, you've got the guy in his, we'll call it a Tesla for want of a better word, who follows him. And they get down to the Channel Tunnel, and the guy parks up his Range Rover and he goes in to have something to eat before the train. The Tesla guy plugs his car in at the Channel Tunnel. Then at the other side, they're heading down, they get to the outskirts of Paris. I think we might stop for lunch. So the guy in the Range Rover stops for lunch. The guy in Tesla stops for lunch, plugs it in. Then they get down to, they're not going to do it all in one day, so they're going to go to an overnight a hotel somewhere. So the Range Rover guy stops at the hotel, and in the background, guess what? The Tesla guy's plugging in because there's a AC charger there. And then when they get down to the south of France, they both arrive at pretty much the same time. Yeah, and it changes the mindset that it can't be done. Yes, there are things you've got to do slightly differently, but it doesn't mean that it's impossible. And it doesn't mean that you're having to sit and make extra stops and wait for an extended period of time, which again is another one of the misperceptions or the misconceptions that people have about electric vehicles. I've got to spend hours charging. Well, I don't know about you, but I spend 25, 30 minutes tops when I'm charging, because I don't go all the way to 100%. And I'm charging because I'm doing something else at the same time. So that's kind of my idea. So I think between us, we've got the market corner, haven't we?
Yeah, nailed that. Who's going to give us the money? That's the question. No, I totally agree with that. And I also think, let's imagine a neighbour of mine goes to Scandinavia and tows something in his Audi estate. And they do the trip. It takes 23 hours. He goes with a member of his family. They do it in one go. Fine, can't do that in EV. Totally agree with you. Can't do that in EV. And if you did do it in EV, every 4 hours, your brakes would be 15 minutes longer. Oh no. That's a good outcome, mate. And likewise, you move to, I've got an article I'm working on at the moment on charge rate. Do we need absolutely massive charge rates? Because those drivers are so irregular. You're talking about fractions of a percent. Does it justify something that would allow you to charge in under 5 minutes to put 200 miles in it? And when I'm thinking about these long journeys, I always think of basically in the UK, maybe in France, because it's basically, if you drive through France, you realize there's nothing in it and it just goes on forever. But in the UK, if you average 50 miles an hour on a long trip, you've done pretty well, because you're going to hit some of those 50 mile an hour bits. You're going to do a bunch of 70. You're going to get, either end of your journey, you're going to go around. So it doesn't take long to work this out. 200 miles is 4 hours. I'm bored after 2, Gary. I don't know about you, but I'm going, do I want a Costa or a Starbucks at that point? And I'm starting to look for where I'm going to go. And of course, I'm now may well twin that with topping up my car. But it's just not a hardship at all, right? It really isn't. And it's it's almost the fact that you have to do that you might have to do a slightly additional stop. And I think for most driving, in my instance, I was looking for a Costa or a Starbucks when I was driving petrol cars as well, just because I'd get bored. I've done crazy miles in the US and, driven for 9-hour days and stuff like that. It's not great. If you were going to extend my stops by 15 minutes, I wouldn't cry about it. Okay. But I can sort of see that there may be some tiny amount of value there. For the most part, I just don't think there is. All you're doing is describing to me what the status quo is. It wouldn't be materially worse if it took you 50 minutes longer. And if you drove like a normal human and you stopped like a normal human and you emptied like a normal human, because this is quite a critical thing that a lot of people on the internet seem to forget. I don't want to look in the footwells of their cars. But we do need to not only take on food and drink, but we need to release the previous food and drink at some point. I'd be surprised if you find you actually stop for much longer at all. And I think your example is a really, really good one. I actually did something similar. A friend of mine lives in Switzerland, got married in Lausanne. So that was not an inexpensive few days down there. But we went down and again have a Tesla so could use their network, and basically did exactly as you described. And it was a doddle the entire way. You can't do long journeys. And I was like, well, I went to, it was Verbier that they got married in, Verbier from mid Sussex. I felt that was reasonably long and it was a doddle, and that usually ends that conversation pretty quick.
Yeah. I mean, I've said it on the podcast before. In the EV rally last year, the London Brighton EV rally, we went down to Geneva, and Tim Rocksmith, who was driving, and I came back from Geneva to my house in a day. We stopped in Paris for lunch, and that was it. Basically, we did a little charge just at the ferry port, and that was it. It was a non-event.
Yeah, 100%. Now, if you were doing the London to Brighton and ended in Geneva, I would question your sat nav at that point. Things have gone wrong on that journey, but the point stands. It was an impressive journey.
Yeah. No, for the listeners, London to Brighton EV rally it was London to Brighton, and then there's a separate rally that goes Brighton to, now 2 years ago we went Brighton to Paris. Last year we went Brighton to Paris to Geneva. This year we went Brighton to Bruges to Amsterdam. Again, all electric, about a dozen of us, multiple different cars. We even took a Renault Espace type people mover, a couple of dogs, things like that. A bus we took last year. It's very good. Entirely possible, and no issue. James, I want to bring this to a close. Is there anything finally that you would like to say to the listeners on this topic before we close?
It's a very fine question, Gary.
No is a suitable answer. It's okay.
I think no is probably the answer. So essentially, the one thing I'd like to say to you, Gary, is it's a pleasure to see you again in my new independent capacity. And I thank you very much for hosting me on your as you said, qualified, successful podcast.
Likewise, the pleasure is all mine. James, thanks a lot for your time. Appreciate it.
Cheers, Gary. Bye.
A couple of takeaways from this discussion. We both agreed that there's definitely a need for some sort of educational mass marketing effort covering TV, newspapers, radio, social media, something that's not linked specifically to one manufacturer, but which covers the experience of living with an EV. We're also both agreed that it's both expensive and something that individual groups such as EVA England or Electric Vehicle UK would probably find it difficult to fund by themselves. So we probably need to be looking at alternative ways of doing this. So what do you think? Let me know at info@evmusings.com. It's time for a cool EV or renewable thing to share with you listeners. A Chinese company called SAWS, S-A-W-E-S, is building flying wind turbines that float high in the sky and capture strong and steady winds. These turbines use less material and land than traditional ones, making them cheaper and more environmentally friendly. SAWS aims to produce powerful turbines that can generate as much energy as big ground turbines, but at a lower cost. Obviously, these will need to be placed in locations where there's no chance of hitting things like aircraft, and the ground connections will need to be robust in case of extremely high winds. But if they prove to be scalable and commercial, they should be great. The EV Musings podcast is sponsored by ZapMap, the go-to app for EV drivers, helping you find and pay for public charging with confidence. See what charge points are available right now with live availability and unrivaled UK charge point coverage at your fingertips. Pay at thousands of charge points within the app or with the ZapMap charging card. Join over 1 million EV drivers, download ZapMap and charge with confidence. Now, I hope you enjoyed today's show. It was put together this week with the help of James McKemey. If you have any thoughts, comments, criticisms, or other general messages to pass on to me, I can be reached at info@evmusings.com. On the socials, I'm on Blue Sky at evmusings.bsky.social. I'm also on Instagram at evmusings, where I post those little short videos and the odd podcast extract regularly. Why not follow me there? Many thanks to everyone who supports me through Patreon on a monthly basis and through coffee.com on an ad hoc basis. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, why not buy me a coffee? Go to coffee.com/evmusings and you can do just that. ko-fi.com/evmusings. Takes Apple Pay too. Regular listeners will know about my 2 ebooks. So you've gone electric and so you've gone renewable. Now they're 99p each or equivalent, and you can get them on the Kindle store on Amazon. Now check out the links in the show notes for more information, as well as a link to my regular EV Musings newsletter and associated articles. Now, I've spoke to a few of you, and I know that you're probably driving, walking, jogging, ironing, or sat on the sofa watching this on your phone. But if you can remember and you enjoyed the episode, drop a review in iTunes, please. Like, subscribe, leave a comment on YouTube, because it really helps. Thank you very much. If you've reached this part of the podcast and are still listening, thank you. Why not let me know you've got to this point by messaging me at musingsev.bsky.social with the words promo, promo, promo. Hashtag if you know, nothing else. Thanks as always to my co-founder Simon. I wondered if he'd ever thought about leveraging his electric unicycle friend group to start a food delivery service. I know he's been thinking about it for a while, and I wasn't sure he'd gone into the same level of detail about it that I had. He told me
that's a really interesting idea, and I wouldn't say I've done any more thinking than you, Gary. That sounds like you're quite advanced in your thinking on this.
Thanks for listening. Bye.